Welcome to Rise Up Tonight, a place for reflection, truth, and hope. Each episode, we share short devotionals, thoughtful sermons, honest conversations, and encouraging messages that point us back to the gospel. Our goal is simple: to bring the light of Christ to our community one moment at a time. Whether you're ending a long day or just looking for something real, we're glad you're here. This is Rise Up Tonight. Let's grow in grace together.
Thank you, John, for having me tonight. So when I speak, I need a timeline because I'll be all over the place if I don't. But I also do it because I don't stand up here to share all the ugly details of my past. I'm up here to share what God's done in my life and what He's pulled me out of. So I'm Tara. I was born and raised in Brandon, Mississippi. I was raised in church my whole life. It was me and my parents growing up. We were in church every Sunday, but I grew up having only a head knowledge of God, and that was my choice. You know, I was held accountable to the truth. We were in church every Sunday, and I thought that just having a head knowledge was going to get me into heaven, and I could live my life however I wanted to. I was not raised in a home in addiction. I never saw my parents drunk. I never saw them use drugs. But I did walk through, childhood abuse. So starting at age 7, I experienced sexual abuse from a family member. And I kept that a secret for 26 years. And that's heavy, and that's a lot for a child. I was confused. I was scared. And so with holding that in, I carried a lot of anger, a lot of rage, a lot of, defiance, rebellion. And I went through my childhood thinking that something was wrong with me. I felt like being around my friends, I always felt different, but I never knew exactly what it was. So having all of those feelings at such a young age, I stayed in trouble. I stayed in trouble at home. I was very defiant, very rebellious, very stubborn, and I carried those emotions with me throughout my life. And so starting around 5th grade is when I, kind of was considered the problem child. I stayed in trouble at home, and then I started getting in trouble at school. It was usually my mouth, my attitude, my issue with authority. And so that went on throughout my elementary, junior high years. So at age 15, I had my first drink. And 16 is really when I got the wild reputation. I was drunk every weekend, getting high. And so by 18, it was the full story. I was pretty much doing it all. Whatever was offered to me. If I was at a party, I would take or drink whatever you gave me. I had no limits. I had no fear. Typical teenager, I thought I was bulletproof. But there was always something different about me with my friends. They had an off switch. And I was the teenager that did not. I lacked that. And so I literally stopped when my body made me, And so towards the first of the night, I was life of the party, but by the end of the night, I was obnoxious. Nobody wanted me around. So that was pretty much my high school experience. And by the grace of God, I somehow graduated high school, and I got accepted into hair school. So shortly after I graduated, it was 2 weeks after my 9th birthday, and something very traumatic happened to me. After I graduated, I started hanging out with the wrong crowd, and I kind of put a barrier between me and my friends that I grew up with because they clearly had more sense than I did. And, they warned me, and they were like, this isn't a good, group to hang around. And I did what I wanted, like I always did. And so that led me being at the wrong place at the wrong time. So the thing with me throughout my life, I had the kind of personality and mindset, it only took one time for anything with me. First time to drink, I was hooked. First time smoking weed, I was hooked. So first time really me being in a place that I should not have been, that I knew I should not have been in, it took that one time. And so that led me to being taken and held against my will in a dope house. During that time, I endured more abuse, more trauma, and that later on resulted into me being traded for drugs. So during that time of my life, God was there, but I didn't see it at the time. But He had His hand on me the whole time, and that's how good He is. I never asked Him to. That was the most traumatic thing that I could think of at that point in my life, because the childhood abuse, I blocked that out. I swept it under the rug and I just pretended it never happened. But this, this was real life, and I wasn't going to forget it. I was 19. And so, anyways, I never cried out to God. I was told if I tried to leave, that person would kill me. I was told if I called somebody, if I called my family, that person would kill me and my family. So I was scared. For the first time in my life, I wasn't going to test the waters like I always did. And so, but God was in that situation, and he opened a door for me to escape. He literally opened the door to the house that I was in. And he gave me the courage to run out, and I did. So I ran away. I got out. But instead of getting out and running to God, I got out and I ran to the world. I never leaned on him during that time. I never saw that he allowed me to get out of that, because that was nothing that I ever would have had the courage to do myself. So with me getting out and running to the world, that was truly when my addiction started at 19. So I fell into a really dark depression. I lived in a constant state of fear. I looked over my shoulder everywhere I went. I was afraid that person was going to find me and kill me or take me again. I felt alone because, once again, I go home and I have this huge secret, so nobody knew. And so during that time, I started drinking excessively. In my mind, that was the only way to cope. That was the only way to get through it. Because the way I was raised, it wasn't safe to talk to somebody or to tell anybody anything. So I started drinking a lot. And, it got to the point where I was scared to leave my house. So, I would drink alone in my room. When I did go out, to places, I kept something on me, just to take the edge off so I could get through it. So I lived my life that way for 2 years. And at 21, I had all I could take. I couldn't keep living like that. So at 21, I was clinically diagnosed with having a mental breakdown. That put me into a psych hold. And so I was sitting in psych, and I'm just, I'm figuring out what I'm going to do. Of course, everybody in my life is like, what in the world, because I seemed like I had it all together, and so when I got out of psych, I willingly admitted myself into rehab at 21, and, I had no idea what I was doing. I was still a kid, all my friends are celebrating and I'm going to rehab. So anyways, I did my time through that program, and I really had this mindset, but I thought going to rehab was going to heal me. Like, I thought that was going to be my cure-all. And so I went through the program. I got out. I took 0 tools with me that I was taught there. I did not put any of the work in to staying sober. I got out, I jumped immediately into a relationship that I was strictly told not to do in rehab. And, of course, the guy drank, he did drugs, all his friends did. And I was around all that, but the only difference was I wasn't doing it. And I was miserable. Like, I was absolutely miserable. And so I stayed sober for a year. And after a year, I started smoking weed again, and I was bought myself, well, it's not alcohol. So, technically I'm not relapsing, which anybody in here that's in recovery, if you're in recovery and you alter your state of mind with anything, you're going to go back to your old ways. It's just a matter of time. So very quickly after that, I relapsed with alcohol. And also, one thing I've learned in recovery, each relapse you have is going to be worse every single time. And you're not always promised your next relapse. So that relapse also led me down the road of prescription drugs. Again, the person I was at the time, it only took one time. So I was offered a pill that I had never had before, and it only took one time. And so that very quickly, of course, at this point, I'm out of college, I'm working, I have my own place, and that spiraled so quickly. I lost my apartment. I almost lost my car. I had to move back in with my parents. And it also led to an accidental overdose. And so for the first time in my life, a substance actually scared me. And so I put the pills down, but I never quit drinking. I couldn't do it. And so after that, I stayed in the bondage of addiction for 10 years. So at age 23, I met a guy, and he lived long distance. He lived 2.5 hours away. He did not know anything about my past. And so this guy, he didn't drink. He never done drugs, never been to jail. He didn't even have a speeding ticket. So to me, that was completely foreign. And so we dated for about a year, and I moved in with him. And so that was when I moved to Mathiston in 2014. I've been there ever since. In 2015, I got married. And during this time with me moving up here, I saw a fresh start. Nobody knew me. Nobody knew anything about me. I didn't have to look over my shoulder to go get gas, I didn't have to worry about that guy finding me. And so I did still drink, but it wasn't like I was back home. I would drink on the weekends, socially, I thought I actually had it under control. But I'm sure at some point we all have thought that. So I did that, and, I was doing good. In 2017, I found out I was pregnant, and I ended up losing that baby. And that was more emotional for me than I thought initially that it would be when I first found out. I think when I first found out, I was kind of in shock. But then all the emotions came after that. And so I did with that what I've always known. I didn't want to feel emotions. And so I started drinking pretty heavily. And again, I was taught at a young age how to hide stuff and not talk about it. I went throughout my teenage, early adult life drinking, and nobody even knew how much I was drinking. And so at that point, I pretty much became a professional closet drinker. So I did that for about a year, and I found out I was pregnant again, and so I quit everything. I had my daughter in 2019, and one thing I realized, you have a lot of unresolved trauma and stuff in your life. You may not even realize you do. I didn't realize how much I had in me, but when you have a child and you become a mom for the first time, you're quickly reminded of all the things that you've been through and the things that you haven't talked about. And then all the fear kicks in because you don't want that for your kid. You want the complete opposite. And so all of that kicked in, and it hit me all at once. And so I didn't want to turn to that anymore. I wanted to set a good example. And so I did that. I did good. And then 2020 came, and things at home were getting bad with me and my husband. On top of that, COVID hit. That was bad for everybody. And so I don't remember what month it was, but it was during the time COVID hit and the whole world shut down. But I temporarily lost my job. And the fear of the unknown, which was everybody's fear, but, I didn't handle that well. And so I didn't want to feel that. I didn't want to think about it. And so I started drinking pretty heavily again. And so I was unemployed during that time, I think 3 or 4 months. And I drank every day, starting at lunchtime until I passed out. And so that became my new normal. It started out, like on the weekends, and then I would have a drink in the evening time, and I was just bargaining with myself. And so for some terrible reason, I'm thinking, well, 12 o'clock, that's reasonable, And so I did that the whole time I was unemployed. And then I eventually went back to work. But that had become so much of my routine that when I got off, that was my go-to. I walked in the door and nobody was getting anything from me until I fixed a drink. And so I did that for 3 years. And then 2023 came, and things at home were getting a lot worse. My drinking was getting worse, which makes everything else worse. And so typical addict mentality, I told myself, well, if you leave, then you'll quit drinking. You won't have a reason to drink. So I did. I packed me and my daughter up, and we left. And boy, was I wrong, because my addiction completely spiraled out of control. So I left in 2023, and that was really when God started moving in my life. That's truly when my testimony started. So after I left, I'm thinking I'm just going to completely quit. I don't need to drink. I don't have a problem, right? I was drinking a fifth to a liter a day, and I was going to work. I was a mom. I was functionable, but I was a full-blown functioning alcoholic, and nobody in my life knew. I appeared to have had it all together, and I was struggling, and nobody knew it. And so during that time in my life, like I said, God started moving really heavy in my life, and it started with dreams. So I don't know if any of y'all have crazy dreams, but I'm a firm believer in listening to my dreams. That is one huge way that God speaks to me. So the first dream that I had, and these were recurring dreams over the course of 3 months, I had them. And it was the same 2 dreams, and they were the same every single time. Nothing was ever different. So the first dream I had, I literally got sucked down into the pits of hell. I saw it. I heard it. I felt it. There's a lot of people in there screaming, begging to get out. And it's not a place that any of us want to spend eternity. But when I would wake up from that dream, my bed would be soaking wet, my hair would be soaking wet, and it literally felt like my body was on fire. And sadly, I never saw God in that. I blame the alcohol on the crazy dreams. The second recurring dream that I had, I was in a room. It was all white. Walls, ceiling, floor. There were no windows, no doors. I was down on my knees and I was screaming. And I was screaming the same stuff over and over. And the room was completely empty. So everything was echoing. But I was screaming, I've lost it all. I lost everything. I have nothing. And when I woke up from that dream, I could literally feel the hopelessness and the desperation. And it felt so real. The first thing I reached for was my daughter to make sure she was still in the bed. And then I got up and looked around to make sure I wasn't robbed, because that's being lost and not being with God. Like, that's how I viewed that dream. Like, somebody's going to rob me, And so I had those dreams for 3 months. And then one day they just stopped. I never had them again. But what came after that, it was like God was trying to get my attention. And so it was kind of like, okay, well, those didn't work, so I'm going to use a different method. So he started putting the police in my life. So with me drinking like I did, I never drove sober. Never. And, I started getting pulled over. I was getting pulled over so much that I was starting to think they were out to get me, because I never got pulled over before that. But they would pull me over and they'd let me go every single time. And so I kept doing what I was doing. I got out of it. And so then I started getting pulled over and getting tickets. And I paid the tickets and I kept doing what I was doing. I never changed anything about my life. So then I started having car wrecks. That was around the time that, I was covering my life up so well, but there comes a point in your addiction that people start seeing it. And so that was around the time, I think after my second rental car, people were like, what's going on, And that was when I started getting defensive, like, I don't have a problem, So September 16th, 2023 was the last time that I drove under the influence, and it was the last time that I drank. So this night, it was a Saturday. I woke up just like I always did, started my day just like I always did, drinking. Went through that day, and my daughter told me that she wanted Wade's place. I don't know where anybody in here lives, if y'all are familiar with these locations, but at the time I was living in Manatee, so that's a pretty good stretch. And so I was like, okay, well, let's go. So we loaded up, and I got about 15 minutes away from my house, and I looked down and I forgot my wallet. So I went back home, I got my wallet, got back in my rental car, and when I got back in my car, I felt a feeling that I had never felt before. And it started in the pit of my stomach. And the only way that I can really describe it, it felt like butterflies, like when you're going down a hill or a roller coaster. But it was not a good feeling. It was a feeling of butterflies, and then like something bad's gonna happen. And so it got my attention. So I didn't immediately just back out of my driveway. So I sat there for a minute, and it's like I heard a voice, but it wasn't audible. It was like it was in my own voice, but it was not my thought, because I've driven like this for so long. But something told me in that moment, don't leave. And it got my attention to the point that I was hesitating leaving, but I did it anyways. And so I left. And again, I don't know if y'all are familiar with the locations, but the last known memory that I have of driving that night, I was getting on the Natchez Trace exit to get on 82, and I went into a blackout. And so I drove a good distance in that blackout, and what made me come back to reality was the impact of a car accident. When I came to, I'll remember it like it was yesterday, but I took my hands off the steering wheel and I looked around. I had no idea where I was. It did not look familiar at all. But I remember I took my hands off the steering wheel and I said out loud, "I've been driving." I had no memory of it. So then the panic came into play, and I'm like, I got to get out of here. I just went through the guardrail. So I got on 82, and I told myself, the next median that you see, go back to Webster County and get home. So I found the median, but I didn't get to it because I had blue lights in my rear view. So at that point in my addiction, I was tired. I was tired of faking it. It was a full-time job to cover up my lifestyle versus just throwing my hands up and saying, I need help. So I pulled over, and I didn't realize this at this point, but my tag had been reported 3 times. So the first 2 times was reckless driving. The third time was an accident. And so they were already looking for me. So I pulled over. The cop walked up to my car, asked if I'd been drinking. And I wasn't even trying to cover it up. I said, yeah, it's right here and the bottle's in my trunk, And if you've been in addiction, you also know when you're that deep in it and you're that far gone, you act very out of character. And I did that night. And so I got a DUI. I blew 4 times the legal limit. And, that was all I was supposed to get. But because I was so far gone and I acted so out of character, I also caught 3 felonies. So I got assault on a police officer, child endangerment, and destruction of police property. So my child was taken away from me that night, and I had no idea when I was going to see her again. She unfortunately witnessed all of that, and I went to jail. And so, like I said, I had no idea where I was. I was in a town I had never been to before, but with God, nothing is a coincidence. That was supposed to have happened, and it was supposed to have happened in the town that it happened in. So I was so unhinged that night, nobody would hold me. So they held me in Webster County. And so while I was in jail, some people through prison ministry came in, and they asked if I wanted to go out in the courtyard. They wanted to talk with me, and they wanted to pray over me. And so I went out there, and, they were talking with me, and I knew them. Living in such a small town, I knew who they were. But they were talking with me, and they prayed over me, and after they did, I felt that feeling in my stomach again that I felt the night that something told me not to leave my house. But this time, it was the butterfly feeling, but it was so intense. It was so much more intense, but I didn't have a bad feeling with it. It was like a peaceful butterfly feeling. And it got so intense at one point, I thought I was going to start gagging. It was just, my stomach was just, I thought it was my stomach. And so shortly after that feeling, I started shaking uncontrollably. And I detoxed when I was in jail. I was already shaking really bad, but this was a shake from the inside out. And it was my spirit is what was being shaken. And so after that, I just uncontrollably started crying. I had no control over it. And at one point I looked at the lady, I said, I'm not doing this. And she just smiled because she knew. And so when I did, I just started crying out to God. And I had never done that before. But I started crying out to God, asking him to forgive me. I asked him to come into my heart, and I totally completely surrendered. And sometimes that looks like a courtyard of a jail. And that's where my salvation came into play, is in that spot. And so they gave me a Bible. And this Bible has been with me through a lot. But they gave me my Bible, and so I went back to my cell, and I was just waiting for my court date. And so they finally came and got me and transported me to court. And the judge that I was supposed to have, there's some kind of conflict that came up. And again, Nothing's a coincidence with God. He had handpicked who I was going to have as a judge already. And so a conflict came up, and the judge that I got was actually packing his truck to leave town when he got a phone call and said, "We need you to come to court." And so he came to court, and he came in and he started going through all my charges with me and stuff. And I had never been arrested. I had never been to court. I didn't have an attorney. I didn't know what I was doing. And so he went over all that with me, and he gave me my sentencing, and it was 2.5 years. And I just lost it, because all I heard in that moment was, my child's 4 and she's going to be almost 7 when I see her again. That's all I could think about. And so he continued to talk, and all of a sudden he quit talking. It got quiet, and all you could hear was me crying and hyperventilating. And so it got my attention, and I looked at him, and he just quit talking. He was just in a really deep thought, is what he looked like. And just out of nowhere, he said, "Miss Atkins, are you saved?" And I had never been to court before, but I found that kind of strange that a judge is asking me that in court, And I said, "Well, yeah, I just got saved when I was in jail, And so he paused again, and he said, "I've been a judge for a long time." And he said, "And I'm by the book. If you break the law, you do the time." And he said, "But I'm also a man of God." And he said, "The Holy Spirit has spoken to me a lot, and he's told me to do stuff, and I have not always listened. I've not always done it." And he said, "But this is the first time that the Holy Spirit has spoken to me doing my job." And he said, "I'm going to listen to him." And I didn't know, I had been saved just a couple of days, he was kind of talking over my head in that moment. And he said, "The Holy Spirit's telling me to help you. You don't belong in jail." And so, again, I didn't really know what that meant, but he said, "I'm going to court order you to rehab for 6 months. And after that, 1.5 years probation." And he said, "After that, you'll come back to court. And when you do, I'm going to wipe your record clean." And he said, "I'm going to give you a new start to your life." And I just lost it, So, anyways, I was transported to, which was in the town that I got arrested in, that I had never been to. And I ended up living in that town for 6 months in rehab. It was at God's House of Hope. Everybody in that program and that facility has become my family. And Kilmichael has become what I consider my home. That's my safe place. I go every week to recovery meetings. So when I was walking in, the sign was out front, and underneath the name, it had a Bible verse. And I had never read it before. I had never heard it. But I carry that verse with me every single day. From the first time that I saw it, it has been a huge impact on my life. But it was Jeremiah 29:11. "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord." I just went blank. Jeremiah 29:11. But anyways, I have carried that with me ever since then, because no matter where I'm at in life, whether it's going good or going as planned or just completely chaotic, that verse still speaks to me because it's truth. And so, not long after being in rehab, I got some news, and it wasn't great. And so I caught myself just having a breakdown. I was crying. I was upset. And after about the second time repeating what I was saying, it clicked with me after all that time. But I was crying and I was upset because I was saying, "I've lost it all. I've lost everything. I have nothing." And it was in that moment where I was like, I lived my dream. He gave me 2 dreams if I didn't change my life. The first one was, "You're going to go to hell if you keep on." The second one was, "You're going to lose everything." And so I thank God that I did. I lost my house. I lost my car. I temporarily lost my child. But I thank God that's all I lost, because Joel 2:25-26, I don't have that one memorized. I'm not even going to try. Let me read it. "I will restore to you the years that the swarming locust has eaten, the hopper, the destroyer, the cutter, my great army which I sent among you. You shall eat in plenty and be satisfied, and praise the name of the Lord your God, who has dealt wondrously with you, and my people shall never be put to shame." He took everything from me, not to punish me, but to draw me closer to him. And I did. And when I did, he restored everything. I finished the program. Everything I lost, he completely restored in my life. I have a roof over my head. I have a car. I have my daughter. She's with me 24/7. If you see me, you see her. But he has completely restored everything in my life. And so, I just want to tell y'all, if y'all are ever feeling that butterfly feeling, if you're feeling a shaking in your spirit, don't ignore it. You're feeling it for a reason, and he's trying to get your attention, and he's wanting you to cry out to him. He's wanting to draw you closer to him. If I had ignored that, I wouldn't be up here tonight. I don't know where I would be, but I would not be up here sharing my story. And he has called me to do that. So if y'all are feeling that tonight, if the worship team wants to come up here, don't ignore it. Y'all just don't. Thank y'all.
Thanks for listening and for letting us be part of your walk with God. If something spoke to you tonight, take a moment to reflect, pray, and even share it with someone that may need it. We'll be back soon with more truth, more hope, and more of God's Word for everyday life. Until then, stay faithful, stay grounded, and stay in the Word. Good night, friends.